With the tent flap snapping behind him and dust swirling before him, the old man squinted into the shimmering horizon. Suddenly, 3 men appeared. The old man fought his primal instinct to sound an alarm and raise a defense against these strangers. No need to fear, he told himself, just the 3 of them, and they're on foot and not carrying much. The old man knew the travelers would be counting on him, a herdsman and his tents, to offer a bit of shade and sustenance. We must prepare, he thought to himself. He yelled over his shoulder to the boy tending the herd, "Take a calf for slaughter and tell Sarah to prepare some cakes. We have visitors." Indeed, in those ancient times, the 3 strangers would have been relying on the code of an arid land, which said that a wanderer should be offered hospitality, for it could mean the difference between life and death, especially in a hot, dry season of cloudless skies and scorching sun. The old man, his name Abraham, then hastened from his tent to greet the 3 strangers. "Please sit down here in the shade of this oak. I will bring water for washing and bread for your refreshment." When the meal was prepared, Abraham brought it out to his guests. As they ate, Abraham politely stood nearby. In deference to his guests and in fulfilling the promise of hospitality, Abraham does not join them in the meal. Instead, he gives the strangers their space to relax as he stands at the ready should they need anything else. His hospitality is generous and expansive and does not go unnoticed. Once again, I am bringing us into the stories of the Hebrew Scriptures. I bring them to us because there is a wealth of wisdom here. There is timeless examples of what it means to be human in these stories. And in this story of Abraham and Sarah and the 3 strangers, within this is a message of hospitality. Something profound happens because Abraham is suitably hospitable. So on that occasion of his compassion towards 3 utter strangers who turn out to be emissaries of God, angels, if you will, in that moment of expansiveness, Abraham's 90-year-old, up to now barren wife becomes fertile. And thereafter, a small desert tribe becomes a multitude and a nation. Now, the Genesis story is how the Hebrew people came to be. It's called an etiology, a myth, a legend, an explanation of how the Hebrew people came to be. But the hospitality theme here is an important one because, mind you, Abraham's was not any ordinary host with a most, or merely gentility or social grace. This was Abraham's practice of honoring and caring for the complete stranger, even though it might have been against his instinct to do that. This kind of hospitality practice today is called radical hospitality. And to understand what that radical hospitality is, let us imagine what it's not. So let's imagine that Abraham's receiving the 3 strangers something in a way, something similar to how people come into our congregations our Unitarian Universalist congregations. And there are some great practices, and there are some that aren't so great. So I'm going to hold up what's not so great, right? So if this were the case, Abraham would have said, he would have provided them with water to wash and some refreshment, and said, okay, when you're done, come and share a meal with us, but I'll have to guide you in our food customs so we won't feel uncomfortable with you at our table. I'll also give you a special blue cup to drink from that'll let everyone at the table know you're visiting, and that's why you appear to be a little different, and why you don't know the words to the food blessing. And later, if there's storytelling, you may not understand it all because these stories have been told in our tribe for years, and everyone here knows them well. Just try to follow along. So in many ways, we manifest this in many ways. We think we're being welcoming, but really what we're asking people to do is to come in and make themselves into who we are, right? That's not the kind of hospitality that turned out to be a gift to Abraham and Sarah. And in fact, if Abraham had behaved in that manner, the three strangers would have been so busy trying to follow all the cues that they wouldn't have been able to bestow that gift of progeny and a multitude of nations upon the elderly Abraham and his childless wife, Sarah. The gift of the strangers would have been missed entirely, a gift that had the potential to change everything. What I draw attention to here is as I said, the sometimes well-meaning but misguided hospitality that we engage in. We assimilate rather than trying to integrate. And we do this unconsciously because at our center is a certain level of discomfort with that. It has a significant downside. Expecting people to assimilate to us has a downside because sometimes we unknowingly reject anything of the visitor that they might have otherwise brought in our midst. And I have a great story about that. So I'm going to pull us back into the 21st century and tell you a true story about a friend of mine who was, when I met her, a newcomer to my congregation in Georgia. This is about 20 years ago. She gave me permission to tell her story. She and John were a great couple who, in many ways, just brought warmth and generosity and spontaneity to our sleepy little congregation. A particularly endearing hallmark of Jane's was that she painted cards, like little cards. And she was a talented watercolor artist, and if you needed cheering up, she would, if she thought you were in some way deserving, she would paint a greeting card just for you. If you were sick or, like I said, needed cheering up, or maybe it was your birthday. And parishioners delighted in receiving them. But after 3 years, John got a job offer in the Northeast and they moved away. But before she left, Jane gave me a painted card. The subject was tulips, Friday's tulips, the exact replica of a small pot of tulips that I had brought her a few weeks before on a Friday when she invited me to her house for lunch. Now, it was a few years later, I had an opportunity to go to that Northeast city, and I visited Jane and John, and as we talked, we finally, it invariably came down to a conversation of, Unitarian Universalism and congregational life, and I asked, well, have you all found a church? And Jane sighed, big heavy sigh, and she said, well, it's been challenging. We're finding that we don't fit in well. We tried a few congregations. This is in the Northeast where there's lots of Unitarian Universalist congregations, right? Lots to choose from. So we tried, but we we've had a really hard time getting comfortable with any of them. And then she went on to say that the one that she was in currently, she joined the caring committee, and she told the chair that she did these painted cards, and she would love to offer that as her ministry, her gift. And but apparently the committee chair didn't listen, because when it did come time to send out some cards, the chair put some stationery in Jane's hands and asked her to send those cards. And she said, "Oh, but wait, don't you remember I said that I would paint cards and send them?" And the chairperson said, "Oh, you really need to use this church stationery, otherwise people won't know where it came from." And Jane replied that she would use the church's return on address and so forth, but the chairwoman wasn't satisfied. So the chairwoman insisted that Jane use the stationery, and disheartened, Jane did do as she was asked, but ultimately she drifted away from the congregation. So once again, I want to emphasize that our openness to the gifts of people, or our openness even to inviting somebody in and letting them find their own way in our congregation, can lead to something, can lead to a change. And in the Genesis story, God didn't actually give Abraham and Sarah a nation. What he gave them was a tiny thing, a seed, a beginning. But because Abraham was hospitable, and his hospitality was radical and courageous, everything changed. Now, sometimes the thought of a gift or anything that changes everything, that's a little daunting, right? It's a little scary. We don't always want things to change that much. Yet I do believe that we need to take very seriously what we do and what we're about here in our Unitarian Universalist sanctuaries on a Sunday morning. We need to embody those qualities of the ancient practice of hospitality, so that people's gifts, like hand-painted greeting cards, don't pass us by. Henry Nouwen is a Catholic priest. He wrote a lot of very wise literature, and he said that hospitality is not a subtle invitation to adopt the lifestyle of the host, but the gift of a chance for the guest to find his or her own. So think about how Abraham was. I call what he did almost like being a concierge, right? They're very helpful, but they respond only when you ask for something, right? They give you a few basic information that you need, and then they let you go. I'll be here if you need anything. Also, we need to remember that in these ancient stories, as you know, which is the theme of our stewardship campaign, we are moving from a place that was familiar to a time of wandering in the desert and transition, metaphorically, and this is what we're in right now. And then we are going to get to that River Jordan. And when we do, and when the children of Israel crossed the Jordan walking, because the waters parted once again, God told them, remember that in this promised land for the Israelites, that strangers will come into your land and even become alien residents among you. But God said, strangers should not be oppressed. For you yourselves know how it feels to be aliens, because you were aliens or strangers in Egypt. So this is the implication of which Nouwen speaks, that radical hospitality, being welcoming and compassionate toward the stranger, doesn't mean making them just like us. It means being expansive enough to allow the stranger to be who he or she is, the visitor, and to allow them to make themselves anew in our environment. Now, there's risk in this, both institutionally and personally. By allowing a stranger to make themselves anew in our familiar territory, in that process, we might be changed. So radical hospitality means that we need to develop a tolerance for difference. I mean, just think for a moment what it's like for you to try and, let's say, we speak one language, English, and we encounter somebody that speaks no English, right? Think about what that does to you when you try to have a conversation or interact with somebody that doesn't speak your language. It's a little bit unnerving, right? But we have to learn how to take a breath, step back, relax, and how to not make assumptions, but rather to be curious, and above all else, be humble. You know, after 3 centuries of our religion being part of the dominant culture, we have a hard time understanding why in the world people wouldn't want to do things exactly the way that we do. Or that even somebody who is different in temperament or personality or talents or gifts wouldn't want to abide by my example. We need to start thinking and orienting ourselves in different ways. We need to change that inclination. We must resist our tribal impulse, and that's still very much in us as human creatures. We need to resist that tribal impulse and develop in ourselves the ability to be comfortable in the company of somebody who's very different from us in custom, culture, and appearance. Most important is to make space for people to be comfortably themselves in our midst, what Nouwen calls a friendly emptiness. A friendly emptiness allows the stranger, the visitor, to come in and find their own place amongst us. Now, this is not to ignore the visitor, but to provide Abraham's concierge service. Generous and helpful without being over-solicitous or over-helpful. So how then do we practice radical hospitality? Well, there's lots of practical